Before I introduce these poets, though, I want to take a moment to thank some of the people that made this event possible, although I do not want to be redundant and go through a whole list again, but I do want to acknowledge that Dean John Rosenberg, Phil Snyder, Charlotte Stanford, and Matt Wickman, and all of their respective colleges, departments, and institutes were really integral in getting this thing going, as were all the student drivers who were who still are, in fact, making sure everyone gets where they're going when and where they're supposed to. And I also want to thank my wife for all that she has done to make this event happen. It's really her baby, from the original idea through all histories of planning to the final execution. She has devoted countless hours to making this symposium not just successful, but truly special. And special because Kim is the first person ever to assemble around one topic of inquiry the brightest lights from literary studies, religious studies, and the creative arts. And we should take a moment to acknowledge not just the considerable effort that it took to pull it off, but also to appreciate what it could mean for future creative and scholarly collaborations. Kim has done something really important here, and I, for one, am honored to be a part of it. Now, without further delay, now to the roundtable. We're going to talk about an hour or so, and I'm going to get the ball rolling in a few minutes with an initial question, and then I'm going to get out of the way and let these poets talk and follow the conversation wherever they want to go with it. I will save some time at the end of the discussion for questions from the audience, as I know that there are quite a few people here who are anxious to ask these things. So as I've already mentioned, the participants in today's discussion are three of America's most important contemporary poets. Kevin Prufer, to my immediate left, is the author of 5 collections of poetry, Churches, In a Beautiful Country, and National Anthem being the 3 most recent of them. He is also the editor of several anthologies, including the forthcoming volumes Into English, an anthology of multiple translations, Literary Publishing, the 21st Century, and Catherine Davis on the Life and Work of an American Master. Kevin is the co-curator of the Unsung Masters series and is professor in the creative writing program at the University of Houston. Josh Bell, in the middle there, is a graduate of the Writers' Workshop in Iowa and a former member of the creative writing faculty at Columbia University. He is Briggs Copeland Lecturer at Harvard University at the moment and the author of 2 volumes of poetry. No Planets Strike, his first volume, was published by Nebraska University Press in 2008. His second volume, which is as yet untitled, I believe, will be published by Copper Canyon Press in 2016. Josh's poems have appeared most recently in The New Republic, Tin House, and Boston Review, and are forthcoming in The New Yorker, Jubilat, and A Public Space. Melissa Range, on the end, her first book of poems, Horse and Rider, was awarded the 2010 Walt McDonald Prize in Poetry and was published by Texas Tech University Press that same year. The recipient of a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, a Discovery the Nation Prize, and fellowships from the American Antiquarian Society, YADO, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. Melissa's poems appear regularly in the most prestigious national and international literary journals and magazines. Originally from East Tennessee, she is currently the assistant professor of English at Lawrence University in Wisconsin. Welcome to you all. So I wonder, as a way of starting things off, if you three could talk a bit about what it means to write in the devotional tradition in the 21st century. Some of the most beautiful poems the three of you have written, in my opinion, are devotional poems. Yet I don't think of any one of you as being primarily a devotional poet. So I'm curious how you came to work in the tradition and why it seems so relevant to you now.
Maybe I'll say something about how I came to think about devotional poetry. And it began, I was trying to recall at a table full of poets somewhere or other the name of a poet whose work I liked very much. And I couldn't remember his name. And I was trying to describe it. And I described how his lines worked a little bit and what he seemed to be thinking about in his poetry, and I called him a Christian poet. And all of my friends at the table sort of laughed at that and said, oh, well, does he write for Harlequin or for greeting cards or something? And I kept on saying, no, 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 no. And then finally, I remembered his name, and his name was Scott Cairns, who happened to have been your thesis advisor, which is really cool. And then somebody said, well, he's not a Christian poet. And I said, well, of course he is, you know. And then they said, no, no, he's a poet who happens to be Christian. And I thought that was an interesting sort of way of rephrasing or sort of restructuring who Scott Cairns was. And it led to us, I edited a magazine for a long time called Pleiades, and it led to us at Pleiades decided to publishing a roundtable on this subject, a long feature in which we asked several poets who happened to be Christians or Christian poets what they thought of that conversation. And from that I started to think about sentimentality, since that seemed to be a subject that came up frequently in this roundtable, what it meant to be, you know, what was sentimentality, and why was it that when I tried to recall the name of Scott Cairns, the immediate description that came from Christian poetry seemed to be, oh, he must be sentimental. And one of the things that I decided about sentimentality was that the definition that I was accustomed to, a sort of overwhelming or too much emotion applied to a subject, was in fact a very poor definition of sentimentality, and it was one that led, I think, to this mistake that I felt my friends are making about Scott Cairns. I began to think about. Well, I was also reading about this, so this isn't entirely my idea. It's ideas I've pulled from lots of places, but that I started to think about Victorian sentimental songs, and there's a wonderful essay on this. I can provide it to anybody who wants it. But the Victorian sentimental song, say the song about the child whose father is out drinking, and the child is dying, and says over and over again, "Oh, Daddy, please come home. Daddy, come home." And you know, Daddy doesn't come home because he keeps on drinking, and then the child dies. Right at the end, that was clearly sentimental, but it didn't really fit the definition of sentimentality that I had been accustomed to. It was not you know, falsely constructed situation. It was a situation that probably has occurred many times and will continue to occur. It wasn't that there was too much emotion applied to it. I don't really think there can be too much emotion applied to the death of a child. But what occurred to me was that what has happened in that poem is that it is too simple. That sentimentality seemed to me to be a reduction of a powerful emotion into a simple emotion, or a sort of reduction of emotion into a single channel. And then I started to think about devotional poetry and my position with that, and that also seemed to be, you know, the source of my friends' confusion. That devotional poetry, falsely thought about, seemed to me to be a reduction of a very complex and maybe ambivalent feelings about the divine into the single channel. And when I thought about that and then went back and revisited some of my favorite poets, especially Anne Bradstreet, they opened up for me into a sort of complexity in which, for instance, Anne Bradstreet seems to be, in her famous line, "Is by his hand alone that guides nature and fate," both giving up the power that she wishes she had, and also questioning its rightness, and finding herself unable to speak about her grandchild's death clearly, hence that sort of stumbling of the metrics in that line, and understanding that she has to. And that seemed to me to be a sort of interesting, I'll stop talking now, that seemed to be an interesting position.
We should probably hold this for each other while each other talks, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to concentrate on both at the same time. We'll see. I feel like I'm reading into the record. Just for the record, this table's not round. I come from sort of a long line of unbelievers, people who, my father particularly, kind of looked with some suspicion on religiousness and religion in general. And so much of there was no Bible or anything in my house, or there was one that I discovered in my grandmother's basement, hidden down there like contraband. And I would know that I would listen to, I was born in Indiana, and I would listen to a lot of the religious radio stations just to hear that rhetoric. I just really loved the big, sometimes angry, sometimes soothing sound of it. And I remember finding that Bible in the basement and reading through and being attracted to the voice of the prophets and just the ferocity of that driving kind of voice that's in Job also too. And I think that I just thought of it as a thing that was unavailable or kept from me, and I was just always really attracted to it because of that. So whenever I write religious poems, I feel as if a little bit like I'm rebelling or getting away with it, and I think that's the main reason why I keep being attracted to it. But also some suspicion of myself that I want to believe, like Fox Mulder in the X-Files, that. Amir Baraka said to name something, I think, I'm going to probably mess the quote up, but to name something is to wait in the spot in which you think it will pass, which is kind of I think like a hunting or an ambush metaphor. But I think that when I name God, part of the act of naming God is to hope to see or to hope to feel something, and I think that's how I continue to think of it now.
How's this microphone thing working out? Yeah, okay, good. I think for me, it's hard to think of myself as a devotional poet if I don't kind of get down to the root of the word a little bit. I had to look the word up to see if it fit me. Actually, there's an archaic meaning of the word devote, which means to curse. And that actually really works out well for me. But also, I wrote it down here. So to formally vow, I like this idea of kind of digging in and saying something, and this also seems like a Jobian thing to me. Like, I have something to say to you. I really want you to hear it. That, I think, is where my religious impulse comes from. I have a lot of theological questions. I don't have answers to them, and that's why I write these poems. And I think, for me, I often write in forms, in rhyming forms, and I really turned to the sonnet when I had kind of a slew of unanswerable questions, and they remain unanswerable. There wasn't a resolution in those sonnets, but there was kind of a deepening of the question. And so for me, the tradition of not just religious sonneteers who've gone before me, but those who have really not been afraid to ask difficult and sometimes maybe seemingly blasphemous kind of questions, like John Donne, like Hopkins, like Mark Jarman, who we just heard from, Countee Cullen, many others, but those are kind of my formative poets there to kind of open up a space before me to say, yeah, you can ask those questions. And so I think that's what the tradition offers me, is a space to just keep asking maybe impertinent religious questions.
I'm curious some of the ways in which you can create that space that will allow you to address the not present other and not have it be a reductive undertaking. When Kim and I were editing Before the Door of God, we were excising hundreds of poems because they did seem like they would be more at home, like in the post office on the line, with those making sense of grief and like your friends. Whenever we talk about devotional poetry, Kim and I, we get this sort of the blank stare that maybe we're inspirational in some way. But so many of the poems in the book, in the tradition, are not at all inspirational. And I'm wondering how you go about creating for yourselves that sort of ambivalent space.
I don't know. Why did I push the button? It's temperamental to an extent. I think that I'm not interested in writing anything that's soothing to me. I don't know. I think that there's this philosopher named E.M. I never can pronounce his name right. Cioran. I don't even know if that's right. It's Cioran. Who said that salvation is the death of song. And I think that that's true. I think of all these poets that the Jarman image read to us, and the other poems that we've been talking about, they're all very distressed, and they're all looking to find some sort of closure to that distress. But then when that poem ends, of course, the next poem begins. So I think that for me, there's no easy way for me to believe that it's over. When you write that poem, then you're done writing poems, and I think that just doesn't seem possible. So I don't know how to describe how you would construct that space. It just seems like a space that I don't want to enter. Yeah.
I've been very attracted to the idea that one of the things that poetry is maybe especially good at as a sort of way of creating meaning or communicating is that it can recreate the sense of the human mind at work on an unsolvable problem. And that the way that poetry can do this is often through, for instance, the employment of white space, in which I sometimes believe thought that hasn't yet been articulated exists, and then it becomes articulated when the poem resumes. And this and other tools, the tool of rhythm and the tool of meter and of rhyme and of sound and of line, the sense of line, all of these things can be employed by a poet to create this thinking mind that doesn't have an answer. And the fact that it doesn't have an answer is usually the most important part to me. If it did have an answer, I would be less interested in it, or I would think that maybe another vehicle would be suited to it. For instance, if Emily Dickinson's poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, in which she seems to be simultaneously asserting that God exists, God doesn't exist, God exists in this sort of Emersonian version of a fly, that it seems to be asserting simultaneously mutually exclusive, conflicting ideas at once. That this is exciting to me, and it keeps the poem from being sentimental, or as you say, a post office sort of poem. I imagine if that poem ended, and by the way, the fly is God,
I think thinking about kind of the staking some claim for some space, but really ambivalence being the space that maybe I want. I was thinking about the sonnet sequence. So when I started kind of writing these angsty religious sonnets, I didn't really intend to write a sequence, but then I wrote two, and as soon as I write two, I'm like, oh, well, two's not that interesting. Maybe I'll write a few more. But then what that allowed me to do was actually turn over lots of different and conflicting ideas that I have about God and about theological questions, and I'm often kind of asking questions of theodicy. That seems to be my main little bone that I'm gnawing on. And so the idea that writing, 10 sonnets allows you to create 10 different arguments, and they seem to move the same way, but they don't because the form is so pliable. And I think what's exciting to me about the sonnet as a way to do that, and really any kind of formal poem, I would say, really any poem, you're kind of making up the structure as you go. With a sonnet, especially in a sonnet that rhymes, you don't really know where you're going. You start off asking a question, and the rhyme really does have to help you find the answer. And I really like that kind of element of surprise. And it doesn't lead me to any answers, but it leads me to maybe a position I wouldn't have thought of. That probably doesn't answer your question, but that's all right.
I'm curious if there are things that, as poets, you find that you can do in a devotional lyric, either that you can't do in a secular lyric, or you can do better?
I have something to say about that. Because I don't really feel like I write lyrics that often. But devotional lyric I can write. I often am not putting the I voice in my poems at all. But in these kind of angsty sonnet sequence, I did. And it was kind of this claiming of some kind of agency that I often don't want to be in the middle of my poem. I actually want me to be out of the poem and let something else go on. So it actually gave me a space to claim this thing that I think most poets really take for granted, this kind of subject position of I that I have a lot of trouble with. But I think when I'm kind of taking on the divine, I'm like, I guess I have to claim that now.
Yeah, I think it's a big target to launch a lot of large-sounding argument against. It's different to be arguing in a lyric space devotionally at or against God than it would be, say, like, the person who's delivering you your mail. So that it really allows for this larger kind of allows for larger questions. It allows for a large scope. It keeps you from seeming too highly poetic. I think if you're going against or with God, there's an excuse there that the lines can get big, which I think is like helpful to me. It's harder for me to do that in a secular poem or a straight up like lyric.
For me, I think the tools are the same for me. Whether I'm writing about politics, which is my other position, or about God, often they're mixed up. And God is in the poem about politics as somebody who can help me answer this question, or as a character. I mean, I often think of it. Maybe this doesn't sound right to say, but I often think I stick the divine in a poem as a character who I can argue with, or whose mind I can try to see things through, as a way of leaving my own mind and trying to see a poem that might be about a political situation or mortality or something through a mind that's completely different from my own. It's part of the way I like to explore ideas.
I think that perhaps many readers that encounter devotional poems see these poems as vehicles for devotion, as ways to come to a different or a better understanding of a higher power. However, throughout history, some of these devotional lyrics have also served as covert operators, serving to critique certain political parties, political views. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
The first thing I think of is actually this amazing long poem by Count Cullen called "The Black Christ," where he is talking about lynching in the early 20th century, and it is also an epic kind of conversion narrative, and it's also a dream vision. And so the idea that he's exploring all these theological ideas and also relating it to a culture of lynching is, to me, the most kind of stunning example of religion and something political going on. And it's such a big poem. It's a flabbergasting poem. You should read it.
Like differently from what I said right before when Kevin was talking about the mix between the devotional and the political, I think that kind of sounds right to me. I think of the prophets as like complaining about politics in a lot of ways, but also giving you the news about what's going on locally. So I think that again, it's a way to. I think that you can hide a lot of social critique in religious poems because of the universality of the sense of the conceit of the devotional lyric, which is everyone immediately understands what you're doing. But you can do this in the love lyric too. I think of Anne Sexton's 18 Days Without You, which is also about the Kennedy assassination, or William Carlos Williams' Asphodel, that greeny flower, which is also about nuclear war. That you can, in this sort of known and accepted conceit of the I and the thou, you can have immediate understanding between you and the reader, and then you can begin to start playing with that understanding, and you can smuggle in critique that they may not have normally been willing to hear or to accept. The difficulty with political poems is often that one seems to know one's position before one writes the poem. And that often creates dead poems because you've already foreclosed, like Nietzsche's idea that that for which you can find words is already dead in your heart. And I think that when you put it into play with an unknown, like God, with a big other who's sort of distant from you, then it brings mystery back into that political atmosphere, I think.
Yeah, what he said, and I also like. I guess I also love the idea that I think it's a Herbert Marcuse idea that that a work of art, whether or not God lives in it, a work of art suggests a realm, a sort of perfect realm, against which we can never measure up, and then because of that, it inspires us politically and morally. Through example, and maybe that's something to add to the conversation.
I have more questions, but do you have questions that you want to, anybody? No? Feel free to just cut me off and jump in, I mean, if you want to. Oh, thank you. I'm curious if you have, any of you have felt some pushback about the devotional lyrics that you've written. When I was at AWP, Kim and I were at AWP last year, we met some people who were doing a lot of devotional lyrics, but they seemed unwilling to talk about their relationship to the form in that sort of secular environment. So I'm curious if you have encountered any, I don't know, negativity or pushback.
If I have, I don't know it. I think actually it's become this quirky thing that people are interested in and they want to talk about with me. I don't know if it's keeping things from getting published or not, because I'm kind of, I don't know. I feel like I'm out of the loop in some ways. I don't know that, but I don't think so.
Not so much professionally, but my parents, as I mentioned before, they like, what are you doing out there in Utah? What's going on out there? You're in a book of poems about God? That's very interesting. So I don't really get it from the market or from editors very much, but I do get it like personally.
Yeah, only what I said at the beginning. I mean, I think that personally, not that often. More if I'm talking about it. I think when I'm just handing, when some people are just reading a book of poems, they tend to find in it what they want, and that's, I think in my case, often more political than theological. But talking about it, yeah, I mean, I've had very good debates about that with graduate students, and I've had graduate students who I'll bring up theological poetry, religious poetry, devotional poetry, and they'll also immediately default to that position that says, oh, this must be a poem of one channel, or it must be a poem that's trying to convert me. And then I kind of say, well, I mean, aren't there a lot of ways that, I mean, can't theological thought be similar to political thought in its thinking about a complex idea for which the thinker hasn't really come to a clear conclusion? I mean, yeah.
Have you, Kim, had pushback? I mean,
No.
I was curious.
I don't care. How would I know?
Yeah. I was reading them anyway.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll just ask one more question, then I will turn it over to the audience. And my question is one that I was curious about. When Yale and I were talking, Kim and I were talking about the anthology, I sort of had this naive idea that it was going to be one of one, and then I realized, oh my gosh, a bunch of anthologies of devotional lyrics have been published, and essays about devotional lyric, and I'm thinking of Ilya's God in the House, and I was sort of surprised by that, and I'm wondering why you guys think now is the moment when these things are seeming to flower.
After a godless century.
I don't know. Oh, sorry. I don't know. I suspect it has something to do with a move back toward true sincerity as differentiated from the false sincerity that we've sort of been worried about. But after the postmodern and the aleatory kind of gamesmanship of a lot of poetry this last century, I think that maybe that's part of it. There was that short-lived movement called the New Sincerity. I think that, I don't know if anyone's still calling themselves that, but That seems to be part of the, but like in music, it was like the emo sort of move, I think, which, but I think that's part of it. I think there's just like a move maybe back to an attempt to define some sincerity in the age.
So I worked for about 20 years as a poetry editor, which meant just reading thousands and thousands and thousands of poems every year submitted, generally because it was sort of generally from younger poets, poets who were in graduate school or, to 15 years out of graduate school, we still call that younger. And having spent 20 years doing this, I felt like I've seen trends, that for a while, what you were just saying was true. There were a lot of poems about sort of Barbie dolls and, Gilligan's Island. I mean, but sort of extremely self-aware and self-conscious and often really good. I mean, I'm trying to be sort of neutral in the description because some of them were engaging and kind of brilliant and thinking about media in interesting ways. And then I saw that drop off about 10 years into this, so about, the turn of the century suddenly. And I don't know what to ascribe it to except that maybe poets just, maybe we're just rebelling against what happened before. I don't know. Maybe it was the Bush administration.
I don't have an answer to this either, but I do think that I feel like in the last 5 years I've seen, and I'm thinking mostly of kind of secular lyrics, but I feel like everything is just really dripping with emotion right now that I read, and there's but there's also such a willingness to engage a thou. Like if I read Poetry Magazine, I open it up and there's a lot of thou, and there's a lot of big emotions going on, and that is something that does translate into thinking devotionally about something, whether it's God or a lover or something else. I don't know why. I think maybe what you're talking about, the kind of new sincerity. I mean, that might be part of it. But I don't know the answer though.
Maybe when I started to feel this happening, I was living out in rural Missouri, right off an Air Force base. And not most of my students, a large chunk of my students were Air Force students. And the wars had just begun in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they were seeing that their lives had suddenly changed dramatically. And if they were still going to classes, their future looked a little bit different and uncertain. And I remember my own poetry changing very dramatically then because I felt as if there was something very, very important happening in the world that I was part of. Even if I was in the middle of the country, we had the B-2 bomber flying over my house, and my interactions with people had changed in this little military town. And that made, at least for me, it made me feel as though the stakes were very, very high, and that anything that I was going to say and print ought to participate in these large questions about war. And maybe that's mirrored in other poets. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one. And maybe that has accounted a little bit for the change. And it seems funny that we would go to the devotional, but maybe it's because we're going to big questions. I don't know.
Can I jump in and ask a question just to sort of tease this out? So Melissa was talking about how, surprisingly or maybe counterintuitively, the devotional lyric provides her with a space in which she can perform selfhood, like do the I in a way that you can't elsewhere. Do you think that there's a relationship between that move and this sort of frustration with irony, this sort of frustration with a perpetually distanced through irony approach to things? I mean, I think that it sort of seems to me that you're tracking in a similar direction with this conversation.
Can you ask the last part of that again? I lost the part of that.
I said a lot. But do you think that there's some relationship between that sense that you had that in the devotional lyric, there's a space for you to like perform subject, like you can be a self without having to compromise it or ironize it or something like that, and just the larger questions that the devotional lyric sort of allows access to.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it does allow to perform selfhood. I think a lot of times what I'm trying to do in poetry is I'm actually questioning the idea that the self is what ties a poem together, and actually try to think about it's. And I don't know. Sometimes it comes through actually trying to write narrative poetry instead of lyric, but also it's just, can I write a poem about a tree without me putting this I in there. I know it's technically still me talking, so the I is still there understatedly, but I don't know. I think for me, maybe this is kind of just coming to me now, but I think it's more of an awareness of some kind of community that I am not the center of, and that I shouldn't be the center of, because I'm not the only person in the world. But yeah, I do think that I do have questions of God, and it's true that, you know, most of my first collection is all about war, and is God involved in that? And that did kind of, it didn't start with the Iraq War, but it fueled some of the poems in that book. So I do think there's something going on there, but I don't think I put myself in those poems. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
I think that I think one of the things that I learned while I was writing poetry and living in the Midwest and all of that had something to do with my essential tininess. I remember making a decision at one point that I would never ever write about myself ever again, because that was just meaningless. And I know it's impossible, and you're still writing about the tree and yourself and everything. It's all coming from the same mind, but I think maybe that tininess had something to do, at least for me, with what was going on around me, and by trying to erase myself from the poems, and to pretend, to always ask myself, who is saying this poem, and what is this person's position, and then also sort of including, you know, God in that. You know, God might be saying this poem, or this person might be talking to God. That might be his position. I mean, always sort of asking these sort of context and position questions. Yeah, I think that grew out of the first, and yeah.
Well, do you have any questions for the panel? Oh, sorry, Josh, did you want to? No, you saved me. Go ahead. Yes.
My question was inspired by what Kevin started with, but I hope other people will feel free to answer as well. When I say I'm divided about this, that is not a euphemism for I'm trying to be polite. I'm genuinely divided by what you said about the complexity of religious poetry. As somebody who reads and writes a lot of 17th century religious poetry, everything in me wants to agree. I wonder whether there is some religious poetry that is equally good, that's simple in a lot of ways, though simple is a complicated term. I'm thinking, for example, of some of the medieval lyrics. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether we find this difficult to acknowledge, partly because of the new critical training that's still there, partly because we want to add a kind of respectability.
Yeah, that too. I think when I was talking about it, I was talking about a sort of contemporary way that I see people writing, and that I'm writing. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I was going to come in here and talk about Michael Wigglesworth's Day of Doom, which is one of my favorite poems of all time, and I think of that as sort of rhetorically creating a complex model, but not as a complex poem in itself. I don't feel that it thinks so complexly. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody who knows a lot more about this. I don't have any PhD. That talks about a complicated model but doesn't think complicatedly about it. And at the same time, I think it's a fantastic poem. It's technically marvelous, and if I don't find it to be especially thoughtful, I find it to be brilliant. And so, yeah.
Do you mean simple? How do you mean simple?
Because the word is so complicated.
Right.
I thought we ought to look at it more. I mean, there's so many different ways of being simple. There can be one clear thought. There could be a simple form.
Right. Yeah. I think that the thought never seems. I mean, the thought never seems to me to be simple when the poem works. I think that there's a simplicity in diction sometimes, but I even think of like George Herbert as more simple in diction, particularly the stringence in his diction compared to what happened right before him with the sonnet craze. And I think of him as a simpler poet, and I think that he attempted that. He attempted to sort of move away from the rhetorical bombast of the secular poems that were written right before him in time. But I don't think his ideas or his emotions regarding his thou are ever very simple. And so that's... Yeah, go
if there's time later.
Okay.
I love the image of you going to your grandmother's basement and finding the love that dares not speak its name. And your parents are still trying to recover from this.
Yeah.
But I wonder if the discovery of the Bible, your pleasure in the rhetoric of it, isn't something to think about. The reason that people shy away from devotional poetry or religious poetry is that it's stale, it's used up, there's nothing new here, it's secondhand, we've been there, done that. The thing about the Bible that's so extraordinary is the metaphors are fresh as paint, they leap off the page, and they're generative. Look at the degree to which lyric poetry is footnotes to the Psalter. So I wonder if, in thinking about a vital religious poetry now, if there's something to be learned from the way the Bible talks. And also talk about, nothing settled. Think of the characters in the narratives of the Hebrew Bible or of the Christian Testament. Abraham, mixed bag. Jacob, what a story. David, and then the disciples. It's a collection of complexity, irresolution, faithfulness at the same time. So I'm selling the Bible here.
I'm buying it. I agree with you. I think that it's still just one of the most volatile, chaotic, intense books that we have. I don't think there's any. That I can't think of anything really better than it. I read it. I read it like whenever I can. I'm attempting to steal from it kindly, always. I think it's just the model. I ran a workshop at Columbia, which, when I went to interview for the job there, I wrote down kind of in a fog of terror about flying in through the air, like a phrase that said "Bible as workshop," which actually I wound up pitching that in the interview. I wound up teaching that class, which was we just went through the places I wanted to take a look at, and in each one of those you would write either a psalm for yourself, or you would write like a narrative. You would write just like sort of based on everything in the Bible. And I think it's like for 12 weeks it was something new every week that we could talk about. And I think it's just, yeah, I agree with you all the way.
Yeah, I'm just curious what you all have to say about the role of poetry in liturgy, and if poetry has a specific role in kind of changing the language, the vocabulary we use as contemporary believers, or is it something that's more personal? Is there kind of a communal part of it?
I'm a big fan of poetry as a public thing, not a private thing. So I think absolutely, I think the fresher and more vivid the language, the more precise. There are so many different ways to approach what's divine. You can't really ever get there, so you have to keep trying, and that's why precise language is so wonderful. It can kind of open a space to do that. So I would say absolutely it does.
Yeah, I would. I'm a fan of the sort of generous idea, the Eliatic idea that all of literature, sort of the past and present, exists sort of simultaneously in conversation, and that the conversation is always changing, and that one of the things that writers do if they're reflective writers is that they understand that they're participating in that conversation, or hoping to, even if it's in a very small way, and that way of thinking sort of necessitates also understanding that it's a public conversation.
I'm sympathetic to that Nietzsche quote you referred to, that things we give words to, in a sense, are already dead in our heart, or however it goes. And also, several of the remarks you made, Kevin, that if the poem answers the question, it becomes uninteresting. My experience has been that while the big question at stake remains unanswered, there seem to be a lot of incidental questions that are answered. Maybe questions that I didn't even know I had, that I was asking. And just to give one example of this experience, in Kim's book, A Metaphorical God, she has this speaker complaining, what a maddening God, a metaphor, all frills and periwigs, this kind of idea. And at the end of it, I believed in God more than I didn't before reading it. And so, I don't assume that that's what Kim is trying to do with that poem, but it happened anyway. And so, how do I account for that? That I learned sort of against my will or against my interest, maybe.
I'm not sure to answer exactly that. I just like the way that you describe the definition, the negative definition, as making it a positive result, which I think that's so often part of it. I'm thinking of Herbert's idea of like, Lord, hunt me not, that one, I think that's in one of the affliction poems, Lord, hunt me not, which also means like, please, Lord, hunt me, like, come get me. And I think that like that definition by negation is one way to flesh out in the positive, is to praise, because we're used to the motion toward praise and we're a little bit dismissive of it because it seems so regular. But when you start by a little bit of an attack, I think that's actually, partially, I don't know, we would have to ask Kim, part of the design, like not maybe on you, but on herself as a writer, is that sort of definition by negation actually makes a positive.
So I have a follow-up question from Professor Hoffman's question. So I'm one of Kim's students, and in this seminar class we've been taking on Devotional Lyric. We discussed, we talked about T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday, and we kind of, in preparation for that, we talked about the difference between the Bible, like the tradition of the Bible, the Word of God, versus this upsurge of the Bible as a literature that we find in the modern period. I'm just curious to know how you guys, if you make a distinction between those two traditions, like if you find yourself writing in one or the other, if you have any thoughts on that. So.
I don't think I make a distinction.
I'm still thinking about that.
I don't think I make that, but I want to think about that's one to take home with me. I don't know.
It's too hard a question.
No, it's a big question. That's one of those questions where they say, "Oh, what a good question." I have no answer for that.
Or maybe I could reframe that question by putting it back on Peter, who in our earlier conversation said today, well, I've come to believe that there's the Bible, that's the Bible, and then there's Bible as literature. Maybe if you could illuminate what you meant by that, then that could throw it back forward to, then what do you mean by, well, I teach the Bible as the Bible, but then there's the Bible as literature.
My training is entirely literary, and then when I was given Religion 101, the Bible, to teach, from Alpha to Omega in the Christian Bible, what was I going to do? So I am a Christian. I have grown up in the Bible. I have my conversations and difficulties with it and my joys with it. The only way I could present the Bible was as a literary text, but I established at the beginning that I didn't think it was like, for me, any other text. That it had a claim on me that was different. That didn't mean I wouldn't argue with it or struggle with it, but that it was different. But I also see the Bible as generating literature. One response to the Word of God would simply be to repeat it, as it is, over and over again. But as we see with the Christian Testament, taking on the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't just repeat it. It makes a new account of the old. And it seems to me that in the literature of faith, that process is continually going on. There's new testifying to the testaments, if you will. They stand in a subsidiary relationship, I would say this as a believer, to the scripture itself. But they're offspring. They intensify my reading and understanding of the Bible, Hopkins, you mentioned before, and I'll be speaking about him tomorrow, has brought the Psalter to life to me in a way that none of the other exegetical study that I have done has. So it's a rambling answer again, but there it is.
So this is a follow-up to the question about liturgy. Part of the force of liturgy is that one doesn't come to it as a writer, but as a reader. Right? In other words, you take into your mouth words that were not written or made by you, and measure yourself in relation to them as their speaker. Do I affirm this? Can I affirm this today? Where do I stand in relation to these words? Am I worthy of them? Are they mine? And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about whether you talk about your own practice as readers, where you stand, not necessarily even in relation to liturgical words, but to the words of others, as someone who comes to them, takes them up, and measures yourself in relation to them, as well as makers, that is, makers of new words in some new, potentially liturgical tradition.
Yeah. I think that one of the things I like about writing in this tradition is the way that those past voices seem so alive, and in someone like George Herbert, where I find a kinship to that voice, where I seek his voice out immediately, which I can't really speak too much about liturgical things because I don't really know that much about them. But to me, it seems like a relationship or an example to live up to. The way that Herbert writes, the way that Herbert continually seems to find some kind of solace, even in the middle of these afflictions and rages. So much so that I feel him sort of alive. So I think that the lyric, in a way, because of that, seems transcendent. I'm kind of rambling, but I'm getting to something. That I think that in a way that I think Peter was saying, that Hopkins makes it seem so real and in the moment, is that's part of the way that we think of good poetry as a sort of a plotting out of the way the mind moves through time, and doubts itself through time, or overhears what it's just said in one line and undercuts it and sort of revises it in the next, and then dismisses that and goes in a different direction, because it does seem alive, versus the poems which seem to have answers already. I don't know if that's the case kind of what we're talking about, but like the poet seems so living and present in the moment. In my book, the first book anyway, that had this series of poems called the Zombie Sunday poems, which were all religious poems, but secretly I imagine George Herbert as the zombie who was speaking them. Like I brought him back from the dead to be my speaker, but again, just to sort of like that wish for transcendence over death. I mean, I think that poetry still can do it. It feels like it does it.
I kind of also I sort of have two sort of strains of thought on that, and I can't bring them together very well because I'm just starting to think about them in this way. But one of them is I love the idea that poetry or literature is a way that the dead, the zombies, the dead, speak to the living and the not yet born. And then I also kind of, one of the things I've been thinking about working with my own students is about the way that the literature that I think of as great literature is nearly endlessly elastic, that it shapes itself to the time in which it is being read, that we can't obviously read the Bible or the Odyssey, for that matter, the way the people who wrote it or spoke it can read it or understand it, but that one of the magical things about it is that our encounters with it are also meaningful in ways that the creators couldn't possibly have predicted or understood. and that's a way that I like to think about literature, and that, and maybe if it ceases to be elastic, then it ceases to be magical, or it stops being literature or something. I don't know. It's something I'm just thinking about it here right now. So.
No, I was just going to talk about Dickinson. I'll talk about her. I mean, I'm sure I'll talk about her in some other context.
I don't want to interrupt you. Okay. Well, I just have a quick question, actually, about sonnets. But I'm happy to have anyone answer. You mentioned that sonnets were a particularly attractive vehicle because the rhyme scheme would force you into thoughts or directions that you wouldn't have otherwise gone. And that really appeals to me. I'm wondering though how you deal with the fact that also in the sonnet the opposite is true, because the rhyme scheme is so predictable. So my question, I guess, is two-pronged. How do you negotiate, as a writer of sonnets, how do you negotiate forms that will both push you in directions that are mysterious to you, but which you also know sonically exactly where you have to go? And I guess the second prong would be how, or if at all, this is analogous to the act of devotion itself, kind of knowing on one hand where you're going, but also being completely in the dark about it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not afraid of predictability in poetry. I'm not afraid of predictable rhymes. I feel like, A. Stallings, a wonderful poet, has this great line in she has this manifesto on rhyme, and she says, breath and death, love and above, they still have life in them. Moon and June, you can still write a good poem. She said, there's no kind of there's no prohibition against rhymes. It's bad lines that make bad rhymes. It's not the rhymes themselves. And I think that's totally right. And so I'm not afraid of that. So if I go into breath and death, I'm just going to go. I think there's something really mysterious about choosing rhyming words, and that to me that I'm not going to say it feels like prayer. I'm not even really sure what prayer feels like anymore. But it feels like something really mystical and wonderful when you are just kind of going, what rhymes with paleographer? And then I'm thinking, oh, calligrapher. It's a slant rhyme. Dickinson, by the way. Dickinson. So the idea that there's really this interesting movement, and you do have a set number of lines, and you do have a rhyme scheme. That doesn't mean you can't switch up the rhyme scheme. You can't add a few lines. I mean, Berryman, just add a few more lines. Cullen, I'm writing an English sonnet. Oh, wait, I'm just going to throw in kind of a more Italian stanza here. But if you're being really strict about it, as I like to be, I really like having that structure be a guide. And, I have a lot of angst. I have a lot of anger. It's better for it to be over in 14 lines. It actually, and also, there's this concentration about it that is so wonderful that I don't get to go on and on. I don't get to just say whatever I want. But there's something moving in it. The form is kind of taking over, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
I've had a problem reconciling the language of literary criticism and poetic composition. And I found a solution to it in the works of an anthropological linguist named Alton Becker, who talks about a new philology. And he wrote an essay on Emerson in which he quotes a phrase that goes back to St. Thomas à Kempis: every scripture is to be interpreted in the spirit with which it was written. And that has been quoted not only by Emerson, who attributed it to George Fox, but also by Barton Levy St. Armand in his work on Dickinson. And my question is, there's a tradition that St. Thomas à Kempis was a part of. I think it's called Devotional Moderno, or Religio Moderna. Yes. And it has to do with a piety and a focus and a discipline that seems to be the heart of poetry for me. And I wanted to know if you're familiar with that tradition, or if there are other traditions that have helped you reconcile literary criticism and poetry.
start talking and see what happens. I think the tradition for me usually is just the good teachers in my past. I think that the way you describe accepting each work in the spirit in which it was written, I think that's the experience I've had with the best poetry teachers that I've had, and they're often very good critics of poetry, I think, too. I think that reading how poets write about poetry is also very instructive. I think of the essays of particularly of Richard Howard, which was like a second Bible for me when I was learning how to write poems. It's a book called Alone with America. It's just really, particularly his essay on Ashbery, to whom aesthetically he is diametrically opposed, but his generosity of spirit in an attempt to actually describe what Ashbery is doing is just, it's amazing. I mean, it's a really great essay, but that spirit of it attempting to accept that poem when it comes to you as it was intended. And I think that that's what my best teachers have been able to help me do in workshops. There are a lot of workshops where, you know, you can tell what the aesthetic should be, and you either fail by moving toward it, or you fail by moving away from it, or succeed by moving toward it. But I think oftentimes the best teachers are this step back from that and sort of identify you where you are along what path, and allow you to go in that direction on your own. And I think that sometimes poets can be pretty good teachers in that way.
I was thinking that's a good question. But I was thinking I write a lot of poetry criticism, and some time ago I found myself in the position of when I was writing poetry criticism, I could not write poetry. And then I had to sort of wash my brain of that before I could write poetry. And I started to wonder why that was. And it started me thinking about how I was taught how to read poetry in high school, and how destructive I thought I mean, I went to a good school and I had nice teachers and they were good teachers, but there's something about the way we talked about poetry in high school that I found very destructive, and that was that it was presented to us as a puzzle that we had to solve. Like, you know, we would say this symbolizes that, this symbolizes that, this symbolizes that. You add it all up and you get the meaning, as though it were as though poetry was a kind of coded language, though I agree it can be a coded language and be effective, or as though it were a crossword puzzle, and then once you have the solution, you can turn the page and start a new crossword puzzle. And this really frustrated me because it suggested, first of all, that writing poetry was not a way of communicating, but a way of obscuring communication. You know, when you code something, you're obscuring the communication. And you know, I felt that when this occurred to me that was also how I was sometimes approaching poetry in my own criticism, and which is also a way of failing to acknowledge that poetry is itself, I think, a kind of way we communicate. It might be a way we communicate something very, very complicated, and that might mean that a poem can be very, very difficult. But I felt like its difficulty had to be in some sort of relation to its complexity, or the complexity of the thought. Sometimes I used to tell, I had a conversation with a student, and she said something like, well, Dickinson is being as direct as she can be. You know, it's just something very hard that she's thinking about. And I thought that was a really, really nice way of saying it.
Let's go in the back there. It's not a primary question, I guess a secondary question. The primary question is whether you find that in creating devotional poetry, you find yourself enacting some hallmarks of traditional devotion, you know, sort of ritual, sacrifice, change of position. If you do, I'm wondering if you've thought much about the difference between the poems you're creating and the poems you personify.
Do you mean that our poems are personifying other poems, or that we are personifying?
That you'd be personifying in a way the very thing you're trying to create. And it's a question really about the relationship between the poet and the poem. You know, and whether devotional poetry sort of enacts a different kind of process of reflection in you about who you are as creators of poems.
I don't think for me it does. I mean, when I think about all the poetry I write, I feel like I am the same whether it's a devotional poem or not a devotional poem, or maybe they're all devotional poems in some way. But I want to think about that some more. I think that's a really interesting question, but my gut reaction is no.
I guess my main concern when interacting with the tradition, but also with other poets, is whether I'm appropriating whether I'm stealing from them too baldly, or if I'm able to, in some way, that's the main question I ask about myself when I reach back for George Herbert, for example. Is this a disservice that I'm doing to him? Because I don't want to do that. I don't want to sort of ride off. There's that line in Easter Wings, I think, where he talks about, I can't remember how it works, but it's the word imp that's like, where he's connecting his, imp my wings to that power that he's talking to. And I feel like, in a way, when you imp yourself to Herbert, you're imping yourself into the God above. So it's like I worry that sometimes when I do appropriate or use these spaces, that sometimes I'm doing, like George Herbert, whoever it is, a disservice. That's the main thing that I'm concerned about. But I can't help but grab for those things anyway. I don't know if that answers maybe partially what you're.
No. I'm just interested in hearing you talk about it, actually. I'm interested in the process of reflection that you go through as you create these kinds of poems.
T.S. Eliot we should be conscious and unconscious. I'm good at unconscious. I'm less good at the conscious part. I think the problem maybe you're running into, at least with me, is that I get fearful of looking too closely at it for exactly the same thing that we're talking about right now, which is if I do understand it too completely, then it will be gone as a power source for me. So that's why I get a little cagey around it, I think. I'm not really sure how I want to start to answer it, because I'm afraid if I do answer it for myself, it will be gone.
You have one more question. So when you write devotional poetry, it comes off as a prayer. Does it ever come off as a sacrament or an ordinance for you? I guess I'm wondering, do you just engage with God in a conversation, or is writing these poems something more than that?
Well, personally, for me, it's a conversation. I mean, it's sort of a tool that I use to try to ask big questions and to sort of insert an authority figure into the poem as almost like as a character against whom I can bounce ideas and whose ideas can be reflected back at me. But maybe that's not a satisfying answer. These are very hard questions you all are asking, because. Especially because, I mean, one of the troubles of writing poetry is that I agree with everything you just said. I mean, the sources are unclear, and I don't want them to be clear, you know. But I started as a fiction writer, and and I thought, and I feel like I still use all those tools I learned as a fiction writer, including creating a character, and even though the God character appears in my poems all the time, I'm always sort of thinking of this as just a very large and complicated character that I'm exploring, who's helping me to sort of think about ideas that I couldn't think about alone.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel.